welcome to the SQIP series, Interviews with Distinguished Qualitative Researchers. My name is James Christopher Head. I am an assistant professor of psychology at the University of West Georgia and the early career representative of the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology. And today I'll be speaking with Ruthellen Josselson about narrative inquiry. Dr. Josselson is a professor of clinical psychology at the Fielding Graduate University. She is the current editor of the APA journal, Qualitative Psychology, and is a leading figure in the field of narrative inquiry. Her research focuses on women's identity and human relationships. As a narrative researcher, I have found her work particularly useful in the pragmatic aspects of doing research, issues like conducting interviews, composing reports, and conceptualizing the interpretive authority, interpretive stance, and ethics. I've assigned many of her works to my students, and I asked them to ask questions of Ruthellen, and this interview will be largely reflective of their questions. On that note, we hope that this interview will be instructive for emerging narrative researchers. So, Ruthellen, thank you for joining me.
Well, I'm looking forward to our talk.
Great. So to get started, could you talk a little bit about how you became interested in the psychological examination of narratives?
Well, that's a long story, as narratives generally are, especially about one's life. I think, like many narrative researchers, I had a double major in literature and in psychology, and was interested in psychology because I was interested in the kinds of things that literature can depict so well, which is people's lives, internal experience, the contexts in which people live, all of those things which the great writers have really been able to capture. And I didn't just want to read works and talk about them. I wanted to take those kinds of insights into something like a more systematic view. That is, could we really use understandings of human life to better it, not just to write about it? So it was a way of putting together my interest in people's lives and my hopes to build a better world in some way. And when I was graduating from college, I was still torn about how I was going to put those things together. And it seemed like pursuing a career in clinical psychology was the way to do that, to really grapple with people's lives. But I never lost this commitment to what I think of as the truths of experience. And so much of what I was learning in psychology didn't do that. It broke people up into variables and scales, which didn't seem to relate, in my view, to how people felt and how their lives unfolded. And sort of my foundational story about getting into narrative psychology or psychology of lives occurred when I was just a freshman in psychology, and I was at the University of Michigan. And Ann Arbor is a wonderful city. I loved it, but it gets very, very cold in the winter. And those who were taking introductory psychology had to, as maybe they still do, had to participate in a psychological experiment. We were unpaid subjects in those days, and it was part of the requirement of introductory psych. So I got a postcard that required me to appear for my participation on a very cold and snowy night, and to go to the university auditorium to do this participation. And so as I was trudging through the snow on this freezing night, I was wondering what this could be and why this would be useful for me at all, what I would learn from doing this. As it turns out, I learned something foundational, but I didn't know it at the time. When I got to the auditorium, we were given these booklets, and in the booklet, each page had a a sentence at the beginning on the top of the page, and we were supposed to write a story to go with that sentence. And the first sentence was something like, at the end of her first year of medical school, Anne finds that she's at the top of her class. Write a story about Anne. Now, I was really not in a good mood for having been pulled out of my nice warm apartment and trudging across the campus on this cold, snowy night. So I remember the story that I wrote. On her way home, Anne was kidnapped by the Martians, and the Martians took her to Mars, and they did experiments on her, and I played that out. It was supposed to be anonymous. We were supposed to only have a number, so I figured, nobody would know it was me. And I just made up this nonsense for every story that I had to write, and then went home and forgot all about it. And then 2 years later, I was in an honors class that Jack Atkinson, do you know who Jack Atkinson is? In 1960, what would it have been, 66, he was probably the most famous psychologist in the U.S. He's the person who created the concept of achievement motivation. And there were more studies being done in what we then call need achievement than any other variable. The idea was that there would be individual differences or group differences in the need to achieve. And this concept just caught on like wildfire. And everybody was doing studies with it. And he wrote a textbook on motivation, which was used at just about every university in the country. So he was a really, he was smart, and he was arrogant, and he was famous. So I was in his class in motivation, and we had to do a term paper. And I meanwhile had learned that this study that I was in on that cold snowy night was the study of one of his students, whose name was Martina Horner. And she was studying the obverse of need achievement, which was fear of success in women. And the idea was that women didn't so much need to achieve as they were afraid of success. So she was having people write these stories because she was going to code them for fear of success. And when I learned that, I was pretty misled, because I was at that point I was 19 in 1966, and the whole issue of women's need to achieve and women's fear of success, this was very alive at the time. This was the very early days of the feminist movement. And I had a lot to say about achievement and success. But that story that I wrote about Anne, who got captured by the Martians, had absolutely nothing to do with either my need to achieve or my fear of success. And I felt violated in some way, that I was a participant in this experiment which was going to say something about fear of success in women. So I wrote all this in my term paper. I said it in much more scholarly terms, and I cited a lot of references, but I also referred to my own experience and how that was in no way represented. And I wrote what I thought was a very good term paper. And Jack Atkinson, I still have this paper, Jack Atkinson wrote back to me a 2-page critique of my reasoning, saying in effect that the codes are valid and the study is scientific and all of these other kinds of things. And he ended his commentary by saying that he thought that I should not pursue a career in psychology because I clearly had an emotional resistance to the scientific study of man, which was wonderful.
Yeah.
Scientific study of man, even.
Yeah.
This was great. Well, at that point, so this must have been my senior year, at that point I had already been accepted into the Michigan Clinical Psychology program. I had a Woodrow Wilson scholarship. And he couldn't harm me by this, and I was not going to take seriously his saying that I had an emotional resistance to the scientific study of man. But in some ways, it impelled me even more to follow what I felt was a truth, which is that if you wanted to know something about people, you need to talk to them, and you need to find out about their experience. That this idea of finding indirect subterfuge ways of learning about people wasn't going to tell you anything. And that if someone had interviewed me about what success and achievement meant to a late adolescent woman in the dawn of the feminist era, I think I would have been able to say something interesting. My story about Anne in the medical school class, not interesting. That was just about the cold snowy night. So that's where I kind of came in to the field. And the works that spoke to me at the time were works like Robert White's Lives in Progress, which I read several times, and my goal was to someday write a book like that. I just thought that was a wonderful book, because what he tried to do was take people's life stories and understand them in psychological terms from somewhat different points of view. And then I came across the work of Erik Erikson, which just spoke to me in such a profound way. What Erikson was doing was really trying to understand the intersection of people and their development and the society and culture that they lived in. And he was taking such a complex view of these things, going far past Freud, I thought, in bringing the whole social aspect of experience into psychology. And I was fortunate that my mentor and major professor was a man whose name is Joe Adelson, and he had been a student of Erikson's. In fact, he was in the class the day that Erikson first put up his 8 stages diagram. So he had been very taken with Erikson, and I felt that I had a mentor who could hold the values that were dear to me. And so that's, there's obviously other bits of the story, but that's how I found my footing in psychology and had the support of my mentor, who was very sympathetic to the way I thought about things. It was also consonant with what I was learning in my clinical psychology program, which was psychodynamic in its orientation, so it was a depth orientation to people. And I wasn't just interested in psychodynamics in terms of helping people in a clinical way, but using it to understand people. So that I always had a kind of a developmental, normative orientation. I never got into just being a clinician. I wanted to try to use what I understood from a depth psychology point of view and an Ericksonian point of view to try to understand people. And so when it came time to choose the dissertation topic, I wanted to study identity formation in college women. So kind of putting together the whole Atkinson-Horner experience and what I was learning about Erikson and what I was learning clinically. And I thought that the way to do that was to use the skills I had been trained with as a clinical psychologist to interview people. We were taught to do very depth interviews over 2, sometimes 3 hours to understand a person's whole life in the clinic. So I thought, well, why not do the same thing, only find a random sample of people, do the same kinds of interviews, and then try to understand their identity formation. So that's what I proposed. But at the time, this was already very late 60s, at the time, you weren't allowed to do what was then called a case study dissertation. You had to have variables. And I was positioned well because of another story, which is the story about how when I was in my last semester of undergrad in Michigan, I needed a course to fill in Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11 o'clock because that would have made me a nice schedule and given me the right amount of free time. And it totally didn't matter what I took because I was barely accepted to graduate school. My grades didn't count anymore, so I could do anything. So I was looking through this huge, thick catalog. In those days, of course, we still had a thick catalog. And was just putting my pencil down randomly to see what I could find at 11 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And there was this course in computer programming. And in those days, I didn't really even know what a computer was. a vague idea of some kind of machine that did things. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll take a course in computer programming. That just seems just funky enough to be interesting. And so I did. And so I actually learned how to program the IBM 67, which was at the time the state-of-the-art computer. And the computer, which does a fraction of what iPhone does, filled this entire room, and we carried around these cards and punched them and things. It was actually a lot of fun. But, so I had this skill. And then I needed a job to augment my fellowship, just to have some extra income. And one of the people in the psychology department was Warren Norman. And he was working in the early days of what became the 5-factor personality. And he had gone through the dictionary and pulled out 16,137 words that were personality descriptors. And his idea was to somehow crunch all these words that describe personality into the fundamental traits of personality. And now that was possible because there were computers. So he needed an assistant who knew something about computers, and not many people did. So he hired me to crunch these words by writing a cluster analysis program. And I had some help. I didn't do it all by myself, but I did it. And I wrote a variation of a factor analysis program that rotated the factors so that they didn't have to be orthogonal, which he wanted to do. And I was really into all this statistical analysis. That's how I was making money. And as I was doing this, many of the other members of the faculty started coming to me as a statistical consultant. So I was helping them with their research projects because I knew all this stuff about statistics from doing this computerized work with Warren Norman. So I kind of had this reputation as a statistical maven in the department. So when I asked them, well, why can't I do a case study dissertation? They said, well, it's because you've got to show that you have skills to do statistical analysis. And I said, well, isn't it obvious that I have skills to do statistical analysis? That's what I've been doing for all of you. So they said, okay, well, if you put in a few variables in your study, then we'll let you do the case study dissertation. So that's how I started what has become a lifelong project of studying identity formation in women. I had a random sample then of 60 women, and I administered a few variables, which none of that came out to show anything. But there was enormously rich data about their lives and how it is they came to form their identities in the manner that they did. And I have been following them now every 10 or 15 years for the last 50 years. And
so the paper you wrote about memory and time is still pulling from your dissertation research?
Well, it was pulling from the follow-ups.
Okay.
See, because those women, I interviewed them when they were 21, then 33, 43, 58, and now I'm interviewing them again in their late 60s and early 70s. So the memory and time works because I have memories from all those ages. And so I can look back and see how memory was not retrospectively, but prospectively. This is how this was narrated when a woman was 21, and then this is how she tells it at the age of 58, and then all the points in between. So this is just fascinating, longitudinal data. It's endlessly interesting because every woman is unique, and yet there are patterns. So it does speak to what we have to deal with in psychology, which is the uniqueness of the individual, the similarities across individuals, and also the meaningful differences that occur with subgroups of the larger, whatever you call it, human race. So I'm very passionate about this. I still believe that what narrative inquiry allows us to do is invite people to tell us their stories, and then and then leave it up to us to figure out what we can understand from them in more general or broader terms. So it's not about helping the individual, it's about informing ourselves about what's important in people's lives. And we can do that in a narrower sense if there's something particular that we don't know about, or we can do it in the broadest sense and ask about how do people construct the life narrative? What is meaningful to them? We can ask questions about memory. We can look at how stories change over time, what just the passage of time does to the way in which we understand our lives, even difficult or traumatic experiences as well as positive ones. So that the story that I tell you about my development, I might have told it very differently.
Yeah, I've read the story about Michigan, the night in the snow.
Yeah, I've written it before, so I probably told it differently.
Yeah.
But for this purpose, I'm repeating myself because it was so foundational.
It's a beautiful string of stories. They're the seeds of a lot of things I find in almost all your writing. There's an appreciation of depth, complexity, relationality, history, while simultaneously sort of a reaction to reductivism and variabilization. So it's a beautiful set of stories for sort of like identifying the kernels of what was going to grow into your approach to doing psychology.
Yeah, well, thank you for recognizing that because it's true. And I think we all have stories like that.
Yeah.
Jefferson Zinger talks about them as self-defining memories.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is a self-defined memory, but certainly a professional self-defined memory. That's where it began. And then, of course, over the years, there have been other really important influences, and I have found so much to read with like-minded people. I was very taken by the work of Mikhail Bakhtin. I got into his work in his early 90s, and that was part of my wish to really bring narrative into psychology, not just to do isolated studies, but to think about narrative as what Sargon called a root metaphor, that we start to develop that into something larger, as a way of joining together as scholars to look at an experience. And Bakhtin, in the way in which he talks about complexity, and the way he talks about relationality, that a narrative is we're always speaking to someone. And how do we think about answerability? And how do we think about unfinalizability? And narrative is always in process. So how do we have a psychology that's always in process, that we don't regard people as fixed entities? And we start to look at them as growing entities. So all of these kinds of things were part of wanting to somehow institutionalize narrative approaches as something shared rather than something that just a few of us were kind of doing at the margins. And then another foundational story, which I should tell, is having a Fulbright to go to Israel, and there meeting Amia Lieblich, who was kind of like a double. She was my counterpart. We had exactly the same struggles, the exact same values. She was a professor at the Hebrew University, that's where my Fulbright was, and we found that both of us had been doing our work largely independently and publishing it somewhat independently, but feeling totally outside the mainstream of psychology. And then Jerry Bruner came to give a series of lectures, and we talked to him about this fledgling idea that we had been batting around of starting a journal, a narrative journal. And he said, what a great idea. He was really supportive of it because he was at that time giving the lectures which became the book Acts of Meaning. So he was developing his idea of narrative ways of knowing, and that's what we wanted to do in this journal, was represent narrative modes of knowing. So we started a journal called The Narrative Study of Lives that was interdisciplinary and international. And it was a wonderful journal. It was published by Sage, And we did 6 volumes with them, and there's some fabulous papers in those 6 volumes. And then Sage wanted us to change the format of it in ways that I at least was not really comfortable with. And I at the time, I wanted to see this more within psychology. I loved the interdisciplinary work we were doing, and we were working with scholars from anthropology, education, nursing, sociology, social work, psychoanalysis. It was a wonderful editorial board of narrativists from various countries and disciplines. But I still had this dream of bringing it into psychology. So we then persuaded APA Books to take over the Narrative Study of Lives series. And we did 5 volumes with them, each one around a theme. And those are also there. And then we invited Dan McAdams, who was also very interested in narrative. So Dan joined Amia and I. The 3 of us edited 5 volumes in that series. Also some excellent papers. And then I just started to feel like, okay, so we had this journal. We were still very marginalized. And I wanted to move us more into the mainstream somehow. So gave up that journal and started working politically to try to get to found SQUIP, basically, and to have an organization. And then, one thing led to another, and eventually, after the founding of SQUIP, then we got a journal. It's an APA journal, and it's in psychology. It's called Qualitative Psychology. So it's a realization of what I had always wanted to do.
That's great. You've talked about a few things that actually get really close to one of my students' questions. You talk about Bakhtin, you talk about the sort of distinction between the individual and the patterns, and also wanting to bring in psychology. So I want to take this moment to ask a question that is reflective of Rebecca Gaylor, who just graduated with a master's from West Georgia. She's reared in this humanistic tradition, and she was sort of struggling with the role of the individual or the self in narrative psychology, being exposed to Bakhtin and other approaches. So, can you offer any advice to students who might be grappling with how to think about individual persons in the context of multivocality?
Well, I think that it's wonderful that your student has really gotten the concept of multivocality, because if you think of the self as being dialogic, then there's always this conversation that's going on, but each one of those cells is also reflective of aspects of the culture and the society. So the individual is never separate from that. We are constituted by our social world, and we constitute it, so that we have to be thinking in systems terms. And I think that's what Bakhtin is talking about, is a systemic, if we want to translate this now into social science language, which I don't think we would use, but it's a systemic view of how we take in aspects of what's out there, and then we put out aspects of ourselves. So that's why when I started the story, I said that my interest in human experience and psychology didn't come from just in me. It came from this absolute absorption in literature. And I'm so absorbed in literature. I still read novels all the time. Because I still believe that the greatest psychologist of all time was Leo Tolstoy. Yet we could never aspire to an understanding of human and social experience as is represented in War and Peace. And the best we can do is try to conceptualize aspects from it. So that's part of what I've taken in from what's been around me.
And there's also the piece that you mentioned earlier, which probably maps onto this novelistic notion of being in process.
Yeah.
not seeing the self as a finite, solidified it, but as something that is emerging.
That's right. So that it's always, what are the paths are you representing and where are you going? And how does that relate to your surroundings and your social world as you understand it?
So,
Worlds, not world, it's multiple. Because the self is multiple, and so is the social world. I'm sorry, I just wanted to, I'm really editing myself there because I made the social world singular and it isn't.
Important clarification.
Yeah.
On that vein, I want to ask you about something that I use to introduce narrative psychology to my students. Sargent's, shown the idea of the turn to narrative psychology.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering at this point in time how you make sense of this turn.
Well, I think that we're behind the other social sciences. I think anthropology has been narrative from the beginning. The development of ethnography has been the center, I think, as I understand, what the anthropologists have been doing. Sociology has always had a strong narrative streak. The field that is really way ahead of us in terms of narrative understanding is nursing. And for some reason, the nursing literature we don't cite it, but we should, because they have some wonderful scholars who have been dealing with these issues, and people in education are way ahead. So I'm not sure there really is a narrative turn yet in psychology. I would like to think there is. I think that Bruner tried really hard to push that. Sargent tried hard to promote it. Polkinghorne developed it. So I think we've had some wonderful leaders and scholars. I think that Carol Gilligan's work was very important in terms of bringing a feminist voice that was developed through narrative understanding, because her whole discovery, if you will, discovery and invention, but her coming to the concept of the different voice, what came from narrative studies, talking to girls. And I think that now the multiculturalism is pushing toward more narrative investigation, because you can't really understand diversity and the many subcultures that we have in this country and elsewhere without talking to people and understanding their stories. So I think that this narrative turn is there philosophically. I think people understand it and are sympathetic to it, but yet there's still these resistances in psychology to giving up the realist, hypothetico-deductive foundation. And we're making changes in that. We're finding ways of building bridges to it. So I don't advocate a binary either-or approach. I think that there are questions which require a hypothesis testing, positivistic design. That's fine. I think that we can add to that by putting in a narrative framework that may help understand some of the kinds of results that they're getting. So I don't see mixed methods as mixing things up, but kind of a dialogue. Let's see if we can work together. We may discover something through our narrative studies that you may then want to test with a variable-oriented view, and we may be able to help you understand your variable. So I think that we can be compatriots, but I don't want to be a denigrated minority.
So alongside the idea of being compatriots, do you find anything right now particularly promising in the field of narrative inquiry? Anything that makes you hopeful or optimistic about the field?
This conference, it makes me enormously hopeful. I walk in there and every year it's more and more. There is such energy and there are so many young people. And I just think it's wonderful. There are other conferences I go to and there's all these old people and a few young people. And here, there's just a few old people. And they're young and they've got ideas and they're exploring things and they're trying stuff out and they're not constrained and they're not afraid and they're using either qualitative or narrative methods to really try to get at something that they really want to understand. And they're trying to understand people who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who are outside of the purview of much of psychology. And they're very excited about bringing that kind of understanding to the field. So I think this is enormously hopeful. And the fact that the journal article reporting standards for qualitative was the most downloaded article of any article in any APA journal last year says something about the interest. I think it's just kind of underground a little bit. It's popping up, it's starting to grow. But when I look at this rising generation, I think, there really is going to be a narrative turn.
Do you have a particular wish, perhaps, of how you would like to see the field grow?
Well, I think that ultimately I would really like journals to have a content focus and to publish both quantitative and qualitative work. I think that in some ways the ideal would be for our journal to no longer be needed. Because people could publish whatever they have discovered and is of interest in journals where there's real conversation across this methodological divide. And then qualitative psychology would really be a kind of like psychological methods for qualitative work, which we are not.
So beyond sort of the lingering scientism, what do you see standing in the way of that becoming an actuality?
I think it's probably generational as well as philosophical. Is people really being able to tolerate the idea that there can be more than one way of knowing, and that different ways of knowing can talk to each other, and that we don't have to get rooted in almost a kind of a religious commitment to a certain understanding of science. And I think that that's starting to change, but I don't know. We really have to look at the young people to know that. It's not changing among the old people, but we're going to be gone. So it's the young people that are going to shape this field. And that's why I find this conference so exciting, is to hear young people presenting with ideas they've taken from my generation, but then they've reworked them and reshaped them, and they're carrying them in different directions. So I think that's unfinalizable. I don't know where it's going, but it seems to be headed in a very positive way and in direction, and I love the excitement that I see around it.
So perhaps we can conclude with a set of questions from a young student, Ruthellen. She's a second-year doctoral student.
Okay.
And she asked, 1, what have you learned about yourself from doing narrative research? And 2, how have you been affected by your work? 2 related questions.
Well, the learning about myself question is a little bit conflated with the fact that I'm also a clinical psychologist, and so my work is always self-reflective. It's not like I'm only self-reflective as a narrative psychologist. And in terms of how I've been affected, I think that it's just such an honor and a privilege to be able to be a part of people's lives as they're unfolding, and to be taken into confidence, and to have people be open about what they've experienced. And I have this belief that or maybe it's an ideal, to feel that nothing human is foreign to me. And so everybody that I speak to brings some aspect of themselves which I can then find in myself as well. And it may be a part that I hadn't known about so much. So that I think that an empathic attitude is one in which we're always, in some sense, finding our links, and that is enriching to have to find some connection to even people who are quite different from me. And sometimes even not only in the women's study, but particularly in that study, some of my participants are quite different from me.
Yeah, you're actually touching on a set of questions that a number of my students asked that had to do with this sort of link between what you're talking about, the empathic attitude, and also the ownership of interpretations or interpretive authority. And I had a number of students I could tell who were really wrestling with that.
With interpretive authority?
Yeah, because you're putting in the context of something that comes out of this empathic stance, but I think they might have been interpreting it as something like, well, who gives one person the right to have interpretive authority over another person's story?
Because it's, let me see if I can, it's a complicated question, so I'm trying to frame it in a clear way. Taking interpretive authority means that what we're saying is this is my interpretation of what you have told me. And I own it as my interpretation, so that what the truth in it is the truth of my meaning making, of your meaning making, but it is not your meaning making. So I'm not claiming the right to tell you what you really think or who you really are. I'm just saying that given who I am and I have had this encounter with you, this is the interpretation that I make of it, recognizing that that is completely colored by me and who I am in the world and my social locations and my stances. So what I'm writing about now, this new book, which is completely different from anything I've ever done, has to do with, the working title right now is Narrative and Cultural Humility. And it's about my experiences over 10 years teaching therapy in China. And coming to an understanding, which had been developing all along, is that we each, I as a Westerner and they as Chinese, have foundational assumptions that we cannot see and cannot reflect on. It's like the fish not noticing the water. And that you're only aware of them when these fundamental assumptions collide. And then the experience is, that's really weird.
It's interesting that you went there because a few moments ago you were talking about the truth of interpretation, which strikes me as also one of these fish surrounded by water type moments of what we understand truth to be.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
Someone recently asked me the question about what role narrative can play in what is being called now the post-truth era.
The post-truth?
The post-truth era.
Post-truth era.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I think this is extremely complex, and it came up today in the conference, that whenever I and others have tried to argue a relativistic view of reality, that there is no, reality, but it's only our social construction, it's what we make of it. I would always be asked, well, if it's all relativistic and it's all socially constructed, then people can say that the Holocaust never happened. And this was always the deal breaker, especially in audiences in Israel and other sort of more historically focused audiences. And the only answer to that is that you still have to have some understanding of what constitutes evidence for your interpretation. So an interpretation is not just something out of my head, but it's something that I can tell you about how I came to that interpretation. So that means complete transparency, or as complete as possible transparency, about how the data, and I don't even like the word data anymore, I don't like the word information even more, but how the experience that you are going to be talking about, how you learned about it. So I would tell about inviting you to come and talk to me about some aspect of your experience. I would tell my readers exactly what I asked you. I would tell them how I felt about the conversation. I would tell them how I transcribed the conversation, how I chose what struck me as important, what struck me as important, and then how I understood it and what I made of it, and what my interpretation was, and ways in which my own grounding could have led to that interpretation. So that I built a trail of my thinking for you as reader to make a judgment about. So in that sense, interpretive authority doesn't mean that I'm right. It means that I'm taking responsibility for interpreting it the way I did and trying to tell you how and why and when and where and exactly what that trail was like. And you can either find that interesting and be persuaded by it, or you can say, oh, that's just ridiculous. You made a mistake. That just says you, basically. And there's no answer to the says you. It says me because this is how I came to that thinking. So I don't think that interpretation is oppressive. And in addition, as you may know, I wrote a paper about how what I've come to more recently is the idea that we're not interpreting people at all. We're interpreting texts. And that we have to make a line between the person and the text. Because the person gave the text under very particular circumstances at a very particular time, and that's what we're interpreting when we're looking at a narrative. The person could also make an interpretation of that text, which this is what happened in the 5 Ways of Doing Qualitative Analysis book. The person can make an interpretation of the text, but her interpretation is no more privileged than our interpretations, because it's a text. The fact that she gave the text doesn't change the text. So we're all speaking about the same thing, but coming from different points of view. So I think that's holding relativism as much as we possibly can, and trying to speak to our viewpoints. But it means giving up the notion that we're going to come to one incontrovertible truth. All we can hope for is greater insight. And that's what I'm after.
Beautiful. Well, is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I talked a lot more than I thought I would. Probably didn't say some of the things I wish I would have, but that's the nature of narrative work. This is a conversation at a particular time, at a moment, in a particular relationship, and that's what it is.
Well, thank you very much.